Mark Ruffalo was enjoying a peaceful lunch at a McDonald's in Los Angeles when a 5-year-old boy with a broken toy car quietly approached him and whispered something in his ear. Mark froze, his face turned serious, and he immediately called 911. What happened next would touch everyone's hearts. Before we get into the story, if you enjoy stories like this, let us know which platform you're watching us on in the comments. And if you're not subscribed, we'll have another heartwarming story for you tomorrow. It was a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles. The sky was clear blue, with only a few clouds drifting slowly by. Mark Ruffalo was an actor known for his humility and sincerity. That day, he was on his way to attend a charity event supporting underprivileged children. He spent his time energetically dedicated to a cause he believed in. At the end of the event, he was tired, but his heart was at peace. He decided to do something simple instead of going home or to a fancy restaurant. He stopped in front of a McDonald's. Why not, he thought. Away from the media spotlight, he longed for these simple moments. Despite the hustle and bustle inside, the atmosphere was warm. Families had dispersed, children were playing happily in the play area, and the sounds of orders being placed filled the air. The scent of fries and hamburgers spread a nostalgic warmth. Mark entered unnoticed, wearing a black t-shirt and sunglasses. His simple attire reflected his relaxed and genuine character. He approached the counter, ordered a simple meal, then found a table in a quiet corner of the restaurant. He silenced his phone, put it in his pocket, and began to carefully observe his surroundings. This was one of the rare moments when he could step away from his hectic life and catch his breath. While eating, something caught his attention. A small child sitting at a nearby table was staring at him. The child had blonde hair and was a little disheveled. He was wearing a faded blue shirt and clutching a broken toy car to his chest. It was as if the whole world was inside that toy. The child was nervous but also curious. His eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Mark responded with a warm smile, then returned to his meal. But he noticed that the child was still watching him. It was as if he wanted to say something but couldn't quite work up the courage. The man sitting next to the child was striking. He was tall, dressed in an elegant suit, and had an extremely stern expression. He appeared to be talking on the phone, but he was constantly watching the child. He shot disapproving glances at his every move, even his breathing. Mark could feel the tension at the table. The difference between the child and the man was striking. One was filled with innocence and fragility, the other with coldness and control. This contrast made the atmosphere heavy. As the child grew more restless, he finally did something unexpected. He slowly and timidly got out of his chair, clutching his broken toy car tightly to his chest. His eyes never left Mark for a moment. Silently but determinedly, he began to walk toward him. The restaurant seemed to grow heavy, and the sounds around them seemed to fade away. When Mark noticed the child approaching, he put his hamburger down on the table. When the child stopped at the edge of the chair, Mark focused all his attention on him. His eyes held a mix of emotions that Mark couldn't quite decipher at first: fear, determination, and a glimmer of hope. The small body trembled slightly as he leaned forward, opening his mouth, but his voice was so soft that Mark had to lean in to hear. The few whispered words shook him to the core. As he tried to make sense of what was happening, a movement caught his attention. The man at the table had noticed the child was gone. He quickly turned his head and fixed his gaze on Mark. There was an unfamiliar, harsh threat in his eyes. The man slowly stood up, straightened his jacket, and began walking toward them. Mark appeared calm on the outside, but alarm bells were ringing inside him. He sensed that this brief moment was much more than a casual encounter. The restaurant was now crowded, with people eating and children laughing, but to Mark, those sounds had turned into a distant hum. All his attention was focused on the child standing in front of him. He tried to understand why he was approaching. Ethan was small and defenseless, but his face bore an unmistakable look of serious concern. He clutched the broken toy car in his hands as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in this world. He glanced over his shoulder at the table. The man Mark now recognized as Mr. Harris was still there, phone in hand, watching them intently. His gaze was icy and it was unsettling, as if something was going through his mind. Not knowing what to expect, Ethan quickly looked away and moved away. Mark immediately crouched down to the child's level and spoke in a soft, reassuring tone. "Ethan, everything is okay. You can tell me what happened." The boy hesitated for a moment, clutching the hem of his blue shirt with his free hand, then glanced around nervously. He was trying to make sure no one else could hear. Finally, in a voice so low it was almost inaudible, he whispered, "I can't talk here." Mark took a deep breath. He could clearly see that Ethan was scared, but the fact that such a young child was asking a stranger for help made it clear how serious the situation was. Mark nodded slightly and tried to calm him down. "It's okay, Ethan. You're here now and you're safe." Before he could say anything else, Mr. Harris stood up from his chair. He straightened his jacket and began walking toward them, trying to hide the tension in his eyes. His steps were measured, but the discomfort on his face was evident. Mark stood up and stepped between Ethan and Harris. Harris stopped a few steps away and spoke with a forced smile. "I'm sorry, Ethan can be a little nosy sometimes. I hope he didn't bother you." Mark remained calm. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts. He sensed something off about this man. Without breaking eye contact, he smiled gently. "Actually, he was showing me his toy car. It looks broken, but it's clearly very important to him." Harris narrowed his eyes for a moment, then replied in a soft voice, "Yes, he's very attached to it." He then held out his hand. "Come on, Ethan, it's time to go." But Ethan took a step back and hid behind Mark. He didn't say anything, but even this simple gesture wiped the smile off Harris's face. He took a deep breath. "Thank you for your time, but we really need to go now. Excuse us." As he reached out to Ethan, Mark gently but firmly placed his hand on Harris's shoulder and stopped him. "I think we can wait a little longer. It looks like Ethan wants to tell me something. He wants to talk about his toy car." "Maybe we should let them talk first," Mark said, softly but firmly. At that moment, a waiter approached them with a tray in his hands. "Everything okay?" he asked. His eyes darted to Harris, and a hint of unease flashed across his face. Mark smiled, trying to act natural. "Everything's fine, but Ethan seems a little upset. Could you bring him something to drink? Maybe that will help him relax." The waiter nodded but gave Harris one last suspicious look before walking away. As soon as they were out of earshot, Mark carefully took out his phone and began silently typing a message to the emergency number. He couldn't waste any time. Harris noticed his movement and quickly approached, fixing his eyes on Mark. "What do you think you're doing?" "This is going on too long," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but his tone was threatening. Mark remained calm, but his expression was now more serious. "I'm just trying to make a child feel safe. He needs someone to listen to him. I think you can understand that." Ethan was still clutching his broken car to his chest. He whispered in a trembling voice, "I don't want to go. Can I stay here?" Those few words made Harris pause for a moment. He turned to Mark, his face tense. "I don't recommend you get involved," he said harshly. Mark took a deep breath. He now knew for sure that the situation was much more complicated than he had thought. Ethan was clearly scared, and the slightest mistake could cause him even more harm. Mark had to be careful, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave Ethan alone. At that moment, he pressed the send button. The message had been sent. Harris fixed his eyes on Mark. A silent but intense standoff began between them. Mark felt time running out. Something inside him told him this wasn't over yet. As normal as the restaurant seemed from the outside, laughter, people ordering, the smell of fried potatoes, the atmosphere inside was heavy. Mark, standing between Ethan and Harris, felt the weight on his shoulders. The little boy clung to his broken toy car, as if trying to hide behind it and face the world. His eyes were fixed on Mark with worry. Mark crouched down again, lowered himself to eye level, and spoke in a soft, reassuring voice. "Ethan, you can tell me what's going on." Ethan looked around anxiously. He turned his head as if to make sure Harris was still watching them. Mr. Harris was sitting at the table. He had his phone in his hand, but his gaze was fixed and threatening. Ethan gripped his toy car even tighter. Then he moved closer to Mark. His small body was trembling. He whispered, "I did something bad to my mom. Can you help me?" Mark's heart sank. That voice carried something he had known for years and could never ignore. A cry for help. Ensuring the child's safety was now more important than anything else. Mark looked into his eyes. "It's okay, I'll help you, I promise," he said. His voice was firm but gentle. Ethan nodded slightly. But his fear was still evident on his face, as if he was worried that Harris had already figured him out. Harris noticed the silent communication between them. He stood up quietly. He straightened his jacket and slowly began to walk toward them. His smile was forced, and his steps hid a rising anger. "Sorry to interrupt. Ethan and I were about to leave. Thank you for accompanying him," he said. He reached out his hand, but couldn't touch Ethan. Mark stood up and blocked Harris's path. His posture was calm, but the determination in his eyes made Harris pause for a moment. "He's still talking about his car. I think he needs a few more minutes," Mark said, his voice gentle but firm. Harris's patience was beginning to wear thin. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "You're very kind, but he's with me. We have an appointment." Mark didn't move, keeping his eyes fixed on Harris and staying where he was. "Children need time to express themselves. I'm sure you understand that," he said, his voice free of judgment but firm. Harris couldn't hide his anger for a moment, his eyebrows furrowing, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course, but we're running out of time," he said, then turned his eyes to Ethan, who was hiding behind Mark. "Come on, Ethan, it's time to go." Just then, as Harris was about to move, the waiter reappeared. He took a small piece of paper from his notepad and placed it on Mark's table like a napkin. Mark quickly picked it up and glanced at it. It was a short sentence: "The police are on their way." He took a deep breath but didn't relax. The danger was still very close. He turned to Ethan, smiled gently to reassure him, then turned to Harris. "Why don't we sit and wait a few minutes? Ethan seems like he needs to catch his breath." His voice was still calm and determined. Harris gave him a blank stare but reluctantly nodded. He returned to his desk, but his eyes never left the two of them. Mark began to feel the man's unease intensify. Harris leaned over his phone and spoke quietly. He was clearly growing more nervous by the minute. Mark knew that time was running out. He had to protect Ethan and start digging deeper into the matter. A few minutes later, Harris hung up his phone. He stood up silently, straightened his jacket, and a dark expression appeared on his face that he could no longer hide. "You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into," he said, his eyes fixed on Mark. Mark immediately sensed the threat underlying those words. He had reached a critical moment when he had to decide what to do next. Harris began walking toward the door with careful, measured steps. Mark watched his every move closely. He knew that any sudden movement could inflame the situation. Ethan stood right next to Mark, clutching his broken toy car tightly to his chest. His small eyes were fixed on the floor, and although he didn't make a sound, his body was tense. The silence between them was filled with the muffled voices of the other diners. Meanwhile, Harris stood at the entrance of the restaurant, pretending to adjust his jacket, but Mark noticed that his movement was not ordinary. His eyes scanned the surroundings as if measuring his next step. He then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a phone, and quickly typed something. He then returned to his table. Just then, the attentive waiter approached Mark and whispered, "The police are on their way." Mark nodded slightly without taking his eyes off Harris, acknowledging the situation. Harris sat back down, but his demeanor had visibly changed. He looked more tense. He kept checking his phone, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if planning something. Mark could clearly see that this man was either panicking or trying to turn the situation to his advantage before the police arrived. Harris was still acting as if he was in control, measuring his words and making deliberate movements. When he noticed that Mark was watching him closely, he made the first move. "It seems our conversation has kept you quite busy, Mr. Ruffalo," he said with a mocking smile. Mark's expression didn't change. Ethan still looked scared. "I'm just trying to understand why you're being so cold and distant," Mark said. "Kids sometimes imagine a lot, but they also say what they feel directly. And this child is clearly saying something." Harris chuckled softly, but his voice lacked sincerity. "Children have vivid imaginations. They make things up. They exaggerate. People like you know that well. After all, your job is to tell stories, isn't it?" He pointed to Ethan. "Maybe he's just trying to get attention." Mark crossed his arms, but remained calm. "Maybe, but children aren't usually very good at lying. Whatever's inside them, it comes out somehow." Harris leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table and bringing his face closer. Then let's ask Ethan, he said. Ethan, do you want to do? Do you want to go? Or do you want to stay here and talk to this man? Ethan froze for a moment. His gaze shifted to Mark, then slowly returned to Harris. Ethan gripped his broken toy car tighter with his trembling hand, as if drawing courage from it. Finally, his voice barely audible, he whispered, I want to stay here. These words made Harris's facial muscles tense for a moment. He clenched his fists, but quickly composed himself. His smile was now more forced, more mechanical. All right, he said coldly, but I hope this doesn't take too long. Just then, the waiter approached Mark again. He placed a glass on the table and carefully slipped a folded piece of paper underneath it. Mark took the note without taking his eyes off Harris and glanced at it quickly. We'll be there in 2 minutes, wait. He took a deep breath. He knew he was playing against time. He turned to Ethan, changing the subject to distract him and lighten the mood. Ethan, you told me where your mother is. Do you know if she's safe right now? Ethan was about to speak when Harris suddenly slammed his hand on the table. Everyone at the table flinched. Enough! This is none of your business, Harris said, his voice filled with suppressed anger. Mark slowly turned to him, his voice still calm but this time with a clear determination in his words. If she's really been hurt, this concerns all of us, especially me. Harris leaned forward, locking his eyes on Mark's. I suggest you keep quiet, he said. The words sent a chill down Mark's spine, but he didn't flinch. He now knew for certain that this man was more dangerous than he had given him credit for. He held Harris's gaze for a moment, then slowly stood up. He turned to Ethan and nodded slowly. Stay with me, okay? His voice was still soft, but there was a protective power in its undertones. Then he turned back to Harris. If you want to continue this conversation, we can do it civilly, or you can wait here until the police arrive. Mark's words made Harry pause. He looked around, realizing he had lost control. His eyes glazed over, his face hardened. At that moment, 2 police cars pulled up outside the restaurant. The doors opened and 2 uniformed officers entered with determined steps. Harris immediately noticed, quickly stood up, and straightened his jacket. Turning to Mark, he murmured in a low voice, You made a big mistake. Then he took a step toward the exit. Mark stepped in front of Ethan, standing protectively beside him. It was time to act. Mark couldn't let Harris escape. His eyes were fixed on the exit, ready for action. When the glass doors of McDonald's opened, 2 uniformed police officers entered with determined steps. Their eyes quickly scanned the room, and Mark saw that they had immediately noticed the intense tension at the table where Mark, Ethan, and Harris were sitting. The waiter was visibly nervous. He bowed his head slightly and gestured toward Mark. Mark remained calm but could feel Ethan gripping his arm tighter. The little boy was trembling all over. Mark quickly knelt down and whispered reassuringly, Everything is fine now, help has arrived. Harris stood up straight, putting on a fake expression. He straightened his suit, his movements seeming theatrical. His eyes were hard, his demeanor a mixture of arrogance and contempt. The police officers approaching the door had name tags that read Ramirez and Vega. One was a tall, serious-looking man, and the other was a young woman with the same serious expression. They walked up to the table together. Ramirez spoke. We received a report that there was a problem here. Is everything okay? Harris immediately interrupted, smiling as if he had memorized the line. Everything is fine, officer. It's just a small misunderstanding. We're just having lunch with my son. At that moment, Mark slowly stood up, put one hand on Ethan's shoulder, and pulled him closer. Officers, you need to hear what the boy has to say, he said. Ramirez turned his attention to Ethan, who was standing silently with his eyes downcast. Vega immediately crouched down to the child's level. He spoke in a soft, reassuring voice. Hello, sweetheart. My name is Vega. What's your name? Ethan hesitated for a moment. Then he turned his head slightly toward Mark. Mark encouraged him with his eyes and gently pressed his shoulder to support him. The little boy finally murmured, Ethan. Vega smiled. Hello, Ethan. Everything is fine. Can you tell us what happened? Ethan's eyes shifted from Vega to Harris. At that moment, Harris's calm expression gave way to sudden anger. Don't say anything, Ethan. Let's go, he said harshly. Ramirez immediately stepped in, stepping in front of Harris with a determined stride and extending his arm. Don't move, sir. You're not going anywhere until we find out what's going on here. These words plunged the restaurant into silence. The presence of the police visibly emboldened Ethan. His small body was still trembling, but he raised his head for the first time. He fixed his eyes on Vega and spoke in a soft but clear voice. He hurt my mom, and he said no one could help us. Ramirez and Vega exchanged glances, Ethan's words changing the expressions on both their faces. Mark knelt down once more and leaned toward Ethan. With a warm, reassuring smile, he said, "You're very brave for telling us, Ethan. You did the right thing." Ethan had lowered his head, but his eyes sparkled slightly at Mark's voice. At that moment, Harris's patience snapped. His face flushed, and he raised his voice. "This is nonsense. He's just a child. He's making it up. My lawyer is going to love this," he said, trying to push his way through the police officers. Ramirez stepped forward and pressed his hand against Harris's chest to stop him. His voice was calm but firm. "We'll clarify the situation first, sir. Please stay where you are." Vega immediately turned to Ethan, his voice soft. "Ethan, do you know where your mother is right now? Is she at home?" Ethan shook his head, but there was still deep concern on his face. He replied in a trembling voice, "She can't get up. No one will believe me." Mark moved closer to him and gently placed his hand on his shoulder once more. "We believe you, Bao, okay? You're not alone anymore. Everything will be okay." Harris turned to Mark angrily and forced a laugh. "Really? You're going to believe a child instead of an adult? I can't allow this nonsense." Ramirez remained calm and replied, "Sir, we have sufficient grounds to initiate an investigation. You need to come with us." Harris took a step back, his eyes filled with anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he growled. As he tried to walk away, Vega quickly grabbed his arm. Ramirez helped hold him in place. "Are you resisting arrest?" Vega asked, professionally cuffing Harris's wrists. Harris wasn't resisting anymore, but he was still grumbling under his breath. "You're lying," he muttered as the police led him away. Mark turned to Ethan, who was still standing next to him. He lowered himself to eye level and asked gently, "Can you show us where your mother is? We can go with the police." Ethan was clutching his broken toy car tightly in one hand. With the other, he slowly took Mark's hand and shook his head slightly. His eyes were still filled with fear, but there was a small spark of confidence in them. Mark felt a wave of emotion rising in his chest, but he had to suppress his feelings. It was time to act. Turning to the police officers, he said, "We need to take him home. We still have work to do." A silence fell over the restaurant. Everyone was watching, but no one said a word. Some whispered as they watched Harris being led away by the police. Mark didn't take a step away from Ethan. His safety was his priority. Ethan was still clutching his broken toy car. His little hands were shaking. Mark knelt down again, bringing his eyes level with Ethan's. His voice was calm and reassuring. "We'll get through this together. The police are here. You're safe now. Do you want to tell me what happened with your mom?" Ethan looked at Mark. Tears were welling up in his eyes. He paused for a moment, then spoke almost in a whisper. "I yelled at her. Then she fell down. She said she was okay, but she wasn't." Mark's throat tightened. Those few words clearly revealed the enormous burden this little boy was carrying. They couldn't waste any time. Mark quickly stood up. Outside, Harris was being loaded into the police car. When he returned inside, he turned to the officers and said, "He's worried about his mother. He's afraid to go home." Ramirez nodded, pulled a small notebook from his pocket, and jotted down the address. Vega knelt down beside Ethan. His voice was soft and patient. "Ethan, can you take us to your house? We want to make sure your mother is safe." Ethan hesitated for a moment. Then his eyes shifted back to Mark. Mark nodded slightly, reassuring him. Ethan nodded slowly. "I can show you, but the door is always locked. I don't know how to open it." Mark placed his hand on his shoulder, his voice reassuring. "Don't worry. We'll find a way. Just show us the way." As the police officers prepared to leave, a restaurant employee approached them. He was holding a small backpack. "I think this man left it on his table," he said, turning to Vega. "He must have forgotten it in his haste." The restaurant employee placed the small backpack on Mark and Ethan's table. Mark bowed his head slightly in thanks. At that moment, Harris was shouting from the police car outside. "You're making a mistake. You have no evidence. I'm innocent. Do you understand? Innocent!" Ramirez didn't even acknowledge the shouting. As Vega helped Mark and Ethan into the car, Mark leaned over and began speaking softly to distract the child. "You know, fixing toy cars is actually really easy. You just need a little glue and sometimes a little patience." Ethan's eyes were still fixed on the distance, but he responded slightly to these words. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his eyes, the first glimmer of hope. "Do you think my mom will be okay?" he asked in a trembling voice. Mark looked into his eyes and answered firmly, "We'll do everything we can, Ethan. I promise." As the vehicles approached Ethan's house, the atmosphere in the air changed. The silence became more intense, more threatening. The street was deserted and the windows of the house were closed, with no light coming from inside. When Vega noticed that the front door was ajar, he immediately signaled Ramirez to stop. The car slowed down abruptly. Vega turned and looked at Mark and Ethan in the back seat. "Stay in the car," he said in a short but clear voice. Vega and Ramirez drew their weapons and moved forward silently. Mark turned to Ethan and looked him in the eye. "Stay with me. I won't let anything out there hurt you, I promise." Ethan nodded and held his toy car even tighter in his small hands. The police approached the house quietly. When they reached the front door, each step seemed to echo. The silence was more unsettling than a scream. When Ramirez pushed the door open, the scene inside was revealed. Scattered belongings, overturned furniture, and broken objects strewn across the floor. The signs of the fight were etched into the walls. Vega stopped abruptly as he entered. In the living room, Ethan's mother, Sarah, was crouched on the floor in a corner. She was unconscious. She had an open wound on her head, but she was still alive. Emergency help was called immediately. Sarah's condition was quickly stabilized. Ethan's fears were becoming reality one by one. Meanwhile, Vega and Ramirez opened the bag Harris had left at the restaurant. The notebook inside revealed everything. The pages were filled with detailed notes about Harris's surveillance of Sarah and Ethan, his observation of their behavior, and his plan to abduct Ethan to another state. The notebook clearly exposed Harris's intentions. The information in the notebook clearly demonstrated how serious and premeditated Harris's crimes were. There was no denying it now. Harris, handcuffed, sat in the back seat of the police car, his face in shadow, staring blankly around him. As the police took him away, he continued to mutter threats under his breath. But no one was listening anymore. Mark was completely focused on Ethan and Sarah. The little boy turned to him quietly and took his hand, asking, "Will you stay with me?" Mark looked into his eyes and replied softly, "I'll be here until everything is resolved. I promise." At the hospital, a dawn washed with the promise of a new beginning. Sarah lay silently, hooked up to IVs and monitors. Her face was still pale, but she was now at peace. Ethan held his mother's hand, his eyes occasionally turning to Mark. Mark stood a step away, silently watching over them as if protecting them. After tense hours, the doctor entered the room and delivered the good news. "Your mother is no longer in danger. Her injuries are not serious. She just needs some rest." Ethan took a deep breath, and the relief was evident on his face. He then turned to Mark, smiling shyly but sincerely. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the strongest expression he could muster. A few days later, Sarah was discharged from the hospital. She was still fragile, but she knew she was no longer alone. Before leaving, she turned to Mark, unable to hold back her tears. "I don't know how to thank you. You really saved our lives." Mark, with his usual humility, bowed his head and replied with a sincere smile, "I was just in the right place at the right time. The real hero is Ethan." He was the one who had the courage to ask for help. At that moment, Ethan was holding his repaired toy car in his hands. Mark had arranged for it to be fixed. He lifted the car and showed it to Mark, a shy but hopeful smile on his face. This small gift was a symbol of healing after the pain they had endured. Sometimes broken things could be repaired, and even stronger than before. Inspired by this experience, Mark reached out to a local charity. He stayed in touch with Sarah and Ethan, providing them with the support they needed to get back on their feet. He continued to be there for them. Months later, Ethan was honored by the police department with the title of Young Hero for his courage. Mark was also invited to the ceremony. In the middle of the crowd, Ethan extended a drawing he had made to Mark. It depicted a child and a man holding hands. In colorful letters, it read, "My hero." Mark looked at the drawing with tears in his eyes and smiled. "You're the real hero, Ethan," he said. "Asking for help takes more courage than anything else." If you like this story, we have many more real-life stories that will warm your heart. We're waiting for you on the other side of the screen to discover content filled with hope, compassion, and resilience.